Space colonization will define the 21st century. The entire modern space industry is currently focused on getting people back to the moon and to low Earth orbit, whether that be for building new space stations, moon bases, or just tourism. We are currently rapidly advancing as the second space race between the United States and China is in full swing. I've made several videos about the benefits of space colonization already, like my video called What NASA Does for You, which I think is my best video about this topic. But all this begs the question, space colonization is happening, but why? I'm sure you've heard that we want to explore space for the sake of exploring, to expand our horizons and to know more about the universe where we live. And that is a driving force behind it, but it's not the whole reason. Space colonization is not just for gaining more knowledge, it's also because doing it will make life better on Earth. But how exactly? How does space colonization help life on Earth? And how should space colonization be done to maximize the benefits we gain from it? This video will be a collab with Anthrofuturism, another channel that goes in depth about how to colonize space and the moon specifically. The link to his channel will be in the description, and while I'll talk about what the reasons for space colonization are, he'll talk later in the video about how to do it. Anyways, there are two general reasons people bring up when talking about this. First, and more commonly, they say we should colonize space for more long-term societal reasons. We need space colonies to protect humanity from extinction, or to expand our knowledge and understand the universe at large. Those are noble reasons for expansion, and I definitely do believe them wholeheartedly. However, many don't, mainly that there are problems on Earth crowd. Just as an aside here, stopping space colonization to fix problems on Earth would make things worse, not better. First off, space colonization helps life on Earth, and I'll explain that throughout the video. Second, all technologies are intrinsically linked to one another. Human progression is not linear, it's a web. Improvements made in space can and have been used in tons of other industries, from medicine to telecommunications to manufacturing. And it's the same the other way around. Improvements in medicine can help keep people alive in space. Cutting off an entire industry will only stop progress. Also, problems on Earth is subjective. It means something different to everyone. Mostly people mean things like climate change and poverty. But how do you quantify when problems are fixed? If we fix homelessness, the next problem is hunger. Fix hunger, now it's disease. Do you require utopia before colonizing space? Because that's impossible. Where do you draw the line for problems that need fixing? Space colonization will help fix problems on Earth, and this mindset is just incredibly short-sighted. Space colonization will make things better on Earth, not worse. The people who say we should focus on Earth before going to other planets fail to realize that developing space is focusing on Earth. Space-based solar power satellites can give us a clean energy source to reduce the need for fossil fuels. Resources mined from the moon and asteroids can eliminate some, but not all, Earth-based mining. Space stations conduct medical research to help cure diseases, and satellites monitor the climate to give us an accurate picture as to how Earth is changing. And colonizing space will make all that development easier. It's either we use the vast resources of space to help Earth, or we spend eternity chasing an impossible utopia until we wither away and die on this planet. If we want a future, the only way to go from here is out. This is talked about somewhat less because it usually ties into economic reasons and transportation and resource mining, which is far less interesting than we're sending 1,000 starships to Mars because it's cool. This is what I want to talk about in this video. Space development has already made life far better on Earth, and I talk about this in my video called What NASA Does for You. Space colonization will benefit you, and making life better on Earth is the #1 reason for doing it. Satellites have been enormously beneficial, helping everything from agricultural development to military reconnaissance to climate studies for disaster relief. They've also likely prevented the world from ending with nuclear launch warning satellites. There's a decent chance that you would not be alive today if it weren't for satellites. Space stations are satellites with humans on them, and they're even more important. They can do all the things satellites can, with the added benefits of space medical resources and in-space manufacturing. Two industries that will probably grow massively throughout this century. The more space stations and satellites that exist, the better your life gets, and the more lives are saved with medical breakthroughs like 3D printed organs or medicine producing, both of which are more effective when made without the effects of gravity. There's also the idea of space-based solar, which I already mentioned, a great power source to help us eliminate the need for fossil fuels, which is more efficient than solar power on Earth, and orbital mirrors and shades, which can help us not only reduce but reverse the effects of climate change. There's also stuff that hasn't been created yet, but likely will soon, like space hotels and orbital factories. Factories will help manufacture all the things I've already mentioned, and hotels, despite seeming like useless tourist destinations at face value, will give us important data about how large amounts of people can live in space, and will help fund larger space development projects. Again, I go into more detail on what NASA does for you, and to avoid repeating myself, I'll just highly recommend you go watch that video to better understand all this. But all you really need to know is that the more infrastructure that exists in Earth orbit, the better. Satellites and space stations are well worth the money it takes to build them because they directly make life better on Earth and benefit people alive today. But I wouldn't really consider this true space colonization, which is why I've been referring to it as space development. So now it's finally time to get to the real topic of this video. How exactly does colonizing space, not just developing it, make life better on Earth? This is where things get interesting. We want to colonize space to bring benefits to the people alive today. The best way to do that is to use resources gathered in space to build everything I just mentioned and put it as close to Earth as possible. So the reason to colonize space is to make it easier to build space infrastructure. Sounds like circular reasoning at first, but colonizing and developing space are two very different things. The International Space Station is not a colony, for example. SpaceX's Starlink constellation is space infrastructure, but it's not a colony. Space development is where the real benefits to people are seen, so space colonization is primarily to make space development easier. The current definition of colonization we have can't really be applied to space at all. This isn't like the colonization of the Americas. I personally define space colonization as any infrastructure project that involves creating self-sufficient places where people can live. The ISS is not a colony because it relies on Earth, it doesn't make its own air and water. And space development is just space infrastructure that isn't necessarily self-sustaining. You can't colonize low Earth orbit because there are no resources to use, but you can develop it. We want to colonize space to build near-term things like satellites, space stations, and orbital factories, and long-term things like O'Neill cylinder space elevators and bases on every major rock this side of Mercury. We know why space colonization will make life better. The question now is how to do it. That's important because depending on where we choose to colonize first, the development of space either becomes easier or harder. The most important region of space to both develop and colonize if we want space development to be made easier, to make life better on Earth, isn't Mars. It isn't any planet at all. It's cislunar space. Cislunar space is the region of space surrounding Earth and the Moon. It includes low Earth orbit, geostationary orbit, all of the Earth and Moon's Lagrange points, low lunar orbits, and everything in between. It's an incredibly large volume of space, several thousand times larger than Earth. That's an incredible amount of area to put space infrastructure. And it's also where that infrastructure will be the most effective because it's near Earth. All of cislunar space is close enough together to be in near-instant communication, and readily accessible with Earth and lunar-built rockets, which I'll get to later. Just like cislunar space is the most important region of space, Earth is the most important planet. It has 8 billion people and an entire biosphere, something no other planet has. It also has an entire industrial civilization and a gigantic economy. That's extremely unlikely to change for the next few centuries at the bare minimum. If you colonize Mars, it will never rival Earth, whether that be in terms of population, culture, economic output, technology, or any other imaginable criteria. Earth is going to be the dominant world in the solar system for an extremely long time, and no other place will even come close. I talk about this in my video about why terraforming the moon is a bad idea, but basically you can't rush culture and you can't rush a large population. And because Earth is going to be the richest, most populous, most technologically advanced, and most important planet in the solar system, all space colonization projects are going to revolve around Earth. More than likely, you're getting your funding from Earth. If your investors don't see benefits from your space development project, then you're going to stop getting funding. So, the space colonization projects that most directly benefit Earth are going to happen the fastest. Yes, we'll likely eventually see cities on Mars, but that won't really help the development of cislunar space that much, so it could be a lot slower. People are only trying to do it right now because SpaceX is funding it all themselves with few outside investors. Because there's really only two options for doing it. Either you have to convince investors to fund your Mars city, which right now nobody is doing, or you have to pay for it all yourself and make money another way, which is what SpaceX is doing. Remember, though, that this doesn't mean that Mars colonization is fundamentally a bad idea. I've said it was in past videos, but I've since changed my thoughts on it. Its benefits are just more societal and long-term in nature, while the colonization of cislunar space has benefits that are more practical and near-term. It's just that cislunar space should be targeted before Mars. So, by colonizing space, we are not abandoning Earth. Quite the opposite. We want to colonize space to benefit Earth, which you'll hear me repeat throughout the video. The biggest space colonization projects are being made and will be made with Earth at the center of it all. Cislunar space is the most important place to colonize because that's where we'll see the benefits of space colonization the most. But how will we colonize it? This is important because knowing how to effectively colonize cislunar space and beyond is necessary to decide what space colonization projects are worth pursuing. First, we can just launch space infrastructure from Earth. Space development is primarily for making Earth better, so it should make sense to use Earth to help Earth. But this is a bad idea for several reasons. Earth, most importantly, has an ecosystem to take care of. You can't just bulldoze a rainforest to get iron, build a launch facility on top of it, and launch your rockets from there. You have to be worried about not killing the life here. And even in areas without life, Earth is covered in oceans, meaning 70% of Earth resources are locked under miles of water, and that number goes down even more with life in the way. Even if you find a nice empty place for mining, chances are all the valuable stuff is going to be very deep underground, because Earth has a tendency of resurfacing itself. Volcanoes and tectonic plates push things downward, and life dying on top of this place creates a layer of topsoil. All in all, Earth is just a terrible place for mining. There isn't really a good way to do it that doesn't harm the ecosystem in some way, which is unfortunate. And it's not just mining either. Launching your material is also a massive pain. Earth has the highest surface gravity of any rocky object in the solar system, meaning out of all places in the solar system that aren't gas giants or the sun, Earth needs the most powerful rockets just to get to orbit. That's incredibly expensive. Then we have an atmosphere in the way. Rockets need to pass through said atmosphere to get to space. That means they need to be both aerodynamic, limiting payload capacity significantly, and be built to survive hitting air particles at thousands of miles per hour, which again adds huge complexity, risk, and cost. Earth is by far the worst place in the solar system to build space infrastructure. The entire planet is fighting you on your way, from acquiring the material to launching it. It's a miracle what we've been able to accomplish in space with everything that's stacked against us. So, if we want very large space infrastructure, Earth just isn't going to cut it. At some point, it just stops being worth it. This is why space colonization is needed for space development. Earth just isn't capable of building large-scale space infrastructure. Without colonizing space, we cannot develop space. We're going to need industrial bases on other worlds so we can truly get the benefits of space. You cannot get large-scale space development to make life better on Earth without space colonization. So, the most important place in space to colonize is a place that doesn't have any of the problems Earth does. First, it needs to be close to Earth. That's incredibly important. The easier a place is to get to from Earth, the easier it is to colonize. That mostly just eliminates the entire outer solar system and Mercury. Mercury has a ton of raw materials and is the most metallic planet in the solar system, but it's not a good place to mine unless you're disassembling it for a Dyson swarm. It's the fastest planet, and so the most difficult to get to. Mercury mining is only good if you need it for a highly specific purpose. The outer solar system and Mercury are, in the near-term future, like in the next century, not important places to colonize. Second, it needs to have huge amounts of raw materials. That's easy enough, every large rocky object in the solar system has them. Third, it needs to have low gravity. That eliminates Venus. Fourth, it needs to have no atmosphere. Not just a thin one, none at all. Even a thin atmosphere still has some of the problems Earth does, just to a lesser extent. Again, Venus is out, and so is Mars. And finally, it needs to have no life and no geologic processes. This is important because the more dead a world is, the easier it is for its resources to be collected. Almost every planet meets that requirement except for Venus with its volcanoes and potential resurfacing events. So we need a low-gravity, resource-filled, dead airless rock that's close to Earth. That is the ideal place to build and launch space infrastructure, and so is also the ideal place to colonize first. If we want a future in space, then that's the place to colonize. Not Mars, not the skies of Venus, but a dead, resource-rich, airless rock. That is the perfect place to get resources to colonize and develop everywhere else. It's the place we need to go to first. Nothing else matters until we get there, because colonizing a world like this will make every other form of space development much easier. Obviously, a place like that is not habitable. I'm sure some of you right now are wondering why I'm saying that the best and most important place to colonize is the very embodiment of a dead, uninhabitable world. Surely something habitable is better, right? No. In terms of near-term space colonization, the stuff we'll be doing this century, habitability does not matter. But again, I'll get to that later. Guess which object fills all of this criteria perfectly? The Moon. The Moon is everything we want for an industrial spacefaring civilization. It's extremely easy to get to from Earth, since it's right in Earth orbit. Earth has constant launch capability to the Moon, no launch windows needed, unlike other planets. It has huge amounts of raw materials. The Moon is more massive than the entire asteroid belt, 20 times more. It also has zero geologic processes and minimal life. I say minimal because we've been accidentally bombarding the moon with life ever since we first started launching things to it, and there's almost certainly some bacteria alive on it right now. But a few thousand tardigrades from the crash landing of the Beresheet lander and several bags of human waste from the Apollo missions doesn't count as a biosphere, so we can pretty much say the moon is dead. Not only that, but with no atmosphere, it's been bombarded with metal-rich asteroids for billions of years. With no erosion, all the debris from said asteroids is just left there on the surface. I'm sure you've heard of the benefits of asteroid mining, which we'll get to later. The moon has the resources of millions of asteroids just sitting there. The moon has low gravity and no atmosphere, meaning two very important things. Rockets don't need to be built to withstand air, and they need far less fuel. A perfect launching environment. Unlike Earth, which annoyingly has the only known examples of living organisms in the universe in the way, you can literally just scoop up some moon dust, melt it, get some metal, build something out of it, and launch it. The moon's mineral content has been thoroughly studied. It has iron, gold, platinum, titanium, thorium, everything Earth does. We also know where the best places to mine that stuff on the moon is. And because of the moon's low gravity, it is actually cheaper to launch a rocket from the moon to low Earth orbit than it would be to launch that same rocket from Earth to low Earth orbit. It is easier to get a rocket 300,000 kilometers down to Earth orbit from the moon than it is to get that same rocket through a deep gravity well and thick atmosphere. That should show you both how bad Earth's launch environment is and how good the moon's is. The moon is the most important place to colonize beyond Earth. Mars is not nearly as important. Neither is Venus or Titan or Europa or any other world you can think of. The moon makes colonizing all those places easier. Its low gravity also means that rockets can be much, much bigger. As in, instead of sending 1,000 starships from Earth to Mars, imagine sending just one ship with the volume of 1,000 starships. That's completely possible if we start building rockets on the moon. It has all the resources to do so. If you want a future in space, not only must the moon be colonized and industrialized, it must be colonized and industrialized first. But wait a minute, I hear some of you say. The moon isn't habitable. It has sharp dust and radiation and no water and stuff. You can't live there. So now it's finally time to address the elephant in the room, habitability. I'll keep it short. Habitability doesn't matter. Nobody cares that the moon is dead. We'll colonize it anyway. That applies to Mars and Venus and everywhere else as well. People have a very bad habit of assuming the most habitable places are the best to colonize. That is not true. Yes, Mars is far more habitable than the moon. It has an atmosphere and a more Earth-like day length and a stronger gravity. But no matter what, if you step outside on Mars, you're still going to die immediately, just like the moon. The only real difference is how you die. Habitability will eventually matter in space colonization, in the long term when we're colonizing the entire galaxy. But habitability is also an all-or-nothing thing. A place is either habitable or it isn't. There is no in-between. The solar system only has one planet in the first category, Earth. All the rest fall firmly into the uninhabitable category. Mars having a thin atmosphere and a slightly more radiation protection than the moon doesn't matter. You're going to be living underground on both places anyway. So when talking about the reasons for space colonization that will happen in the next few decades, the habitability of a place doesn't matter. And if habitability doesn't matter, then profitability is the next most important. How easy it is to make money on this place. Or how easy is it to build space infrastructure that I've been saying is the true reason for space colonization. When I say profitability here, I don't strictly mean monetary value, I also mean societal and technological value. Also, the moon isn't nearly as uninhabitable as you think. It's more than capable of hosting a large, self-sustaining civilization with a population in the millions. I talk about this more in my video called Objections for Colonizing the Moon and Why They're Wrong. Because this is somewhat off topic for this video, I'll just recap it briefly and recommend you watch that. If you're about to write a comment about how I'm wrong and the moon is actually really bad for whatever reason, I recommend you watch that video first, because chances are I've already covered it. Low gravity, radiation, and dust are all solvable problems, with several currently known solutions. You bury your habitats to stop radiation, you could use cold gas or electrical charges to repel dust, exercise and limiting exposure solves the health problems with gravity somewhat. The moon could very easily have a thriving, large, and growing population. You can build artificial underground cities with artificial forests and trees and screens to mimic the sky, with weather control and plenty of space for thousands of people. The moon would not be as bad of a place to live as people think, so long as we get around to actually getting the industry working up there. And again, the moon has everything we need for industry. Lunar dust is mostly made of oxygen. We can use that for our air. What isn't oxygen is metals, perfect for building your habitats. Not only that, but certain types of regolith, melted at the right temperature, will create water. Way more than enough for a very large population, especially if you recycle your water. The moon has very little water, however, it has the ingredients to make new water in plentiful amounts. The regolith has been hit for billions of years of asteroid impacts. Everyone thinks that asteroid mining is a good idea because of how much resources asteroids have. Well, the moon has millions of asteroids just sitting there on the surface. Why mine asteroids which are far away, small, and difficult to get to, when you can mine the moon, which is none of those things and has more total resources, with the added benefit of being far closer to Earth? Asteroids will be useful in the long term to build things like space habitats. However, to get to asteroids easier and faster, just like with Mars, it will be better if we start on the moon. We can make bigger, better ships to do more while they're there. In short, just be aware that the moon has water, it has air, it has resources, it has everything Earth has. The moon is the place to build our future in space. Space stations, satellites, ships, orbital factories, you name it. It will be easier to build on the moon once there's infrastructure there. Colonizing the moon won't negatively affect Earth. The moon is far too big for human mining to affect the tides or whatever. In terms of the moon, its habitability or lack of habitability does not matter, because we aren't trying to colonize the moon and make a place for humanity to live. We are trying to colonize the moon because doing so will build our future. Space colonization will eventually be about finding new homes for humanity. Keyword eventually, as in centuries from today. Right now, it isn't. Right now, the only reasons for colonizing space are benefiting people on Earth and making possible the future technologies that will make finding new homes possible in the first place. How we colonize space now will directly affect the next few thousand years of human development, and we need to hit the ground running so our descendants can go farther than we could ever imagine. And the best place to do that is the moon. The moon isn't a habitable place, and that's a good thing. It's such a good place to colonize because it's uninhabitable. It is a place to strip mine and industrialize until we build a spacefaring future that we can't even imagine right now. If you want a future of thousands of people visiting Mars every year, and extremely low launch costs allowing thousands more to venture to low orbit, then you support industrializing the moon. If you support mining the asteroids and sending people to the outer planets, then you support industrializing the moon. If you support building giant space habitats capable of hosting millions of people at once, then you support industrializing the moon. Because industrializing the moon will make all of that possible, and it will do all of that while benefiting Earth along the way. Remember, the most important region of space to colonize is Cislunar space because it's right next to Earth. The moon is the best place to do that. One day there will be millions of people in space at once, and that will be entirely because we industrialized the moon. And that is the number one reason for colonizing space. To get to the moon and industrialize it as fast as possible to get our future truly going and benefit people on Earth. Colonizing space is not just about sending people to new habitable planets to claim them for humanity. Don't get me wrong, that will eventually happen. But the glorious space future you're imagining, of cities on Mars and terraformed planets and voyages to other stars, all depend entirely on what we do right now. If we do not colonize the moon, then you won't get that future. Ever. It's as simple as that. But this video has just turned into a reasons for colonizing the moon video. Colonizing the moon is synonymous with colonizing space, because every reason for doing so inevitably comes back to the moon. But what about places beyond cislunar space, Mars and Venus and the asteroids? To be honest, as I was writing the script, I was trying to think of the reasons for colonizing space beyond the moon. Of course, there are a lot of them. Prestige, extinction prevention, all the same things I mentioned at the beginning. But those are long-term goals. Right now, we need to be focused on the reasons that will benefit the most people as quickly as possible, or space colonization will never happen. Remember what happened the last time we tried exploring space with no long-term sustainable goals. The Apollo program gets cancelled, NASA's funding is gutted, and nobody leaves Earth orbit for over 50 years. Things are different today, but we must be extremely careful to not fall down the same path. Space colonization must be sustainable. We cannot afford the risk of letting all of this die because we got overconfident. Right now, building factories on the moon is just more important than building cities on Mars, because building factories on the moon will help humanity more. One day there will be cities on Mars. This is not a moon versus Mars argument, it's a moon then Mars argument. Both can and will be colonized, but the moon is simply the higher priority target. There is just no place in the universe that has the same benefits as the moon. The closest I can think of are asteroids. They have the same resources as the moon, and are even smaller, meaning launch costs are not just low, they're non-existent. On the small ones, you can just jump to escape their gravity. And they're all relatively close to one another, meaning you can just go from one to the next in a span of a few days to get your resources. Asteroids can also be converted directly into space habitats that are a great place to get carbon and water, which are two things that the moon needs. I think asteroids play a somewhat important role in supplying the moon for the few things it doesn't have. The moon will build ships to collect carbon and water from the asteroids and bring it back, assuming it's not shipping that stuff from Earth. Then asteroids can be used to build the habitats that can house millions of people at once, like O'Neill cylinders. Those are giant habitats several miles long that have the total surface area of a small country, capable of hosting millions of people comfortably. You can make space habitats into any environment you want. You can harvest other asteroids for more resources. You can make them spin for artificial gravity, and make their hulls so thick not even a point-blank nuclear blast could break them. Space habitats are a great thing to build, and we'll eventually have so many of them that people living on them will outnumber planets. But you can just build these places out of asteroids, and you can build them out of the moon as well. Going into the outer solar system, Titan is a great place for nitrogen, which is fairly uncommon in the inner solar system. So is Venus. Saturn's rings are probably the easiest place to get water in the entire solar system. But Titan, Venus, and Saturn only become good places to colonize, assuming you already have a presence there. Which coincidentally is what the moon will give us. The moon opens up the rest of the solar system. All space colonization projects, any you can think of, inevitably come back to the moon somehow. I cannot overstate how important it is to get that thing industrialized as fast as possible. Our future depends on it. So, colonizing Cislunar space, the closest region of space to Earth, will benefit Earth immensely. That's the reason for space development. Satellites will help keep our planet safe, healthy, and connected. Space stations, orbital factories, space hotels, space habitats, and all sorts of other structures will allow millions of people to be in space at once. That's important because doing research and manufacturing things in space will be extremely beneficial to people on Earth, and medical advances made in space will directly save lives. Space-based solar and orbital mirrors will allow us to control the amount of sunlight hitting Earth, allowing us to reverse some of the effects of climate change, though not all. But Earth is difficult to launch from, so we'll want to build this stuff on the moon, which will become the industrial capital of the solar system. That's the real reason for space colonization. All forms of space development are easier on the moon, which will then open up the rest of the solar system, allowing us to protect ourselves from extinction, and create spin-off technologies that will again go back to benefit people on Earth. That's great and all, but how will we do it? I keep saying that we should industrialize the moon, the biggest, most important target for colonization. But how? It's one thing to say we should do this, but it's another to have an actual plan to do it. For that, I'll hand over this video to Anthrofuturism, who's made several very good videos about not just why to develop the moon, but how.
Let's start with a simple thought experiment. Imagine that you are tasked with developing the moon. Your mission, should you choose to accept, will be to establish a lunar industry so that we can establish and supply an ever-growing orbital industry. To succeed, you have to build a working mass driver on the moon, so we can send thousands of tons of mass into orbit. You also need to excavate and transport those thousands of tons of mass to the mass driver from across the moon. So we're talking vehicles and infrastructure as well, not just a standalone mass driver. In other words, you have to develop your way to an industry on the moon that can send things into orbit using a mass driver. To achieve this goal, you are not constrained with what you send up to the moon. You have all the hardware and resources of Earth at your disposal, but you are constrained by how much stuff you can send. The Saturn V could carry about 50 tons to lunar orbit. So let's be wildly generous and say you can send 50,000 tons. That may sound like a lot, but it's only about as much as a single fully loaded Panamax cargo ship weighs. That's it. That's your limit. One Panamax worth of stuff. One Panamax worth of stuff to bootstrap an entire industry on a new world. So, what do you send? I think most people would say they'd send something like a self-replicating rapid prototyper, which can process lunar regolith into more processes. Simple at first, but increasing in complexity over time. A factory that builds machines, which can build more, bigger, better factories to build bigger, better machines. Maybe we can think of those first 50,000 tons that starts all of this as a seed from which everything else will grow. Big things have small beginnings. This is not a new idea. There have been many publications proposing something like this, from von Neumann to Metzger, some with direct human involvement, others fully automated or teleoperated or AI generated. And I think this is the right approach to develop the moon. Except, well, you aren't actually in charge of developing the moon, and you don't have access to all the Earth's resources to do it. Nobody does. And That's the problem. Sure, it would be great if somehow the entire US population and Congress could be persuaded to spend the entire US budget on lunar development, but since there's no oil on the moon, that's never going to happen. Developing some sort of replicating system, as described, would cost many billions of dollars to develop, more than all the crypto schemes and elder fraud added up. How would you justify it? By promising some venture capital groups that if everything goes perfectly on the very first try, we'll have an O'Neill cylinder in 2 decades? This is the problem that has perplexed generations. But what if I told you we actually do have a profitable, self-replicating system that's been around us the whole time? In fact, it built the modern world. The problem is we've missed the forest for the trees. It isn't some supercomputer machine like a forest, it's much more complex and decentralized than any single tree. The free market. The problem is getting it to the moon. The question of how to develop the moon is really a question of how to establish markets on the moon. Humans will perform labor, or in our case, invest in robotic labor, if they believe they can gain a profit from their endeavors. So the question of how to establish markets on the moon is itself really a question of how can we generate profits on the moon. No unprofitable endeavor is sustainable in the long term. The Apollo program is a prime example. The problem for a long time was one of margins. In order to generate profit, you need to earn more than you spend, and the cost of launching anything to the moon relegated everything into the category of extremely unprofitable. Now, this state of affairs is changing rapidly as commercial launch vehicles are posed to lower the cost of transport by many orders of magnitude. We are quickly entering into a new era where we can finally begin to try and answer that great question. How do we profit from lunar development in the near and mid-term? In the near term, tourism is essential as revenues generated here will be the key driver of any nascent lunar economy. I don't like tourists as much as the next conceited local, but a shitty tourism market will be the first thing to drive capital to the lunar surface, and in doing so will serve as a way to bridge the gap between nothing on the moon and a mass driver launching, kilometer consuming, station building lunar industry. Markets need both buyers and sellers, people to procure goods and services, and people to purchase them. Tourism is the lowest hanging fruit on the lunar tree. But what we earn from it will allow us to buy a ladder. It's what gets us from nothing to something. It is useful as a bridge, meant to be crossed, surpassed, and forgotten, for it's what lies on the other side of that bridge that truly matters. The main utility the moon has for us is in its use as a giant ball of feedstock material for ship and station creation. Tourism is just a means to that end. Also, don't underestimate the value of just selling moon rocks. I definitely think polished lunar minerals will be the new diamonds. Once we have some capital and capacity to do things on the moon, we can expand and diversify across a great many areas, from expanding our tourism industry with more resorts and entertainment, to orbital fuel procurement, to satellite manufacturing, to scientific research labs and facilities, telescopes and universities, AI data training centers and internet servers, and especially big, private real estate. All of this growth will happen simultaneously as companies race for opportunities, driving investments into development, expanding domestic manufacturing capacity, eventually culminating in the creation of a mass driver launch system. So you can see how this is the true seed, and fortunately we don't have a 50,000 ton limit. Once a mass driver is established, we can begin to consider things that today seem more like science fiction than serious ventures. Nuclear asteroid tugs, crystal palaces, Stanford toruses, the first generation of an O'Neillian wet dream, the antidote to an Orwellian nightmare. So that's broadly how we develop the moon, the strategic level. But exactly how we develop the moon is a much larger and harder question, but one we're attempting to approximate something like an answer on anthrofuturism now. We have a lot of work to do, but the hope is that by figuring out as many tactical level details as possible, we can potentially help accelerate things once mankind disturbs the billion-year slumber of that desolate ball of feedstock once again. The near term is the most important and deserves all our effort. The market is our ice pick, and we sink the tourist-covered tip of it into the moon to hold us there. We are doomed if we return to the moon just to plant a flag and gather rocks. Then we will know for sure we are in decline. Nothing but cheap parodies of past generations performing in a trashy live action reboot of the original. When we return, we must stay. We can never be grounded again.
So, as you can hopefully see, the moon is not only capable of being industrialized, we also have a pretty good idea on how to do it. I highly recommend checking out Anthrofuturism's channel, as he goes far more in depth about lunar development than I have here. Everything from how to build construction equipment up there, to mass drivers to cargo ships, and how we can power all of it. Colonizing the moon is not a pipe dream a century away. People have been thinking about this stuff for decades, and we are ready. As soon as we get the industrialization of the moon up and running, then soon after that, the entire solar system will belong to us. So, to answer the question of this video, what are the real reasons for space colonization? We want to colonize space not to abandon Earth in search of a new home, but protect it and make it better. We want to make life better for people on Earth using space development, and we know how to do it as well. Colonizing the moon makes all space development easier, as it's right there and has tons of resources. It's not a good place to raise a family, but it's a place to raise a spacefaring civilization. All we need to do now is make it happen. I believe that the more people that know the benefits of space development, the more likely it is to happen, which is why I made this video. Hopefully I've helped just slightly in making this future a reality for the good of all humanity. Our future in space will be amazing, and it's coming fast. But it will only come if we know why we're doing it and how to do it. We must remain focused on the billions of people at home if we want any of this to happen. We must go after the worlds that have the most utility first, like the moon, so we can then later move to the places that will become humanity's true next homes. Space colonization to improve the status of humanity is the true reason for doing it, not for the vague reasons like gaining knowledge. Without going to space, we do not have a future. Not on Earth, not in the universe, not anywhere. So we have to do it right, and make sure we never forget both where we came from and why we're exploring it all. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, check out my other videos about space and space colonization, and check out Anthrofuturism, the link to which will be in the pinned comment.